Emma Rodriguez adjusted her thick winter coat as she walked into the bustling rehabilitation center on a cold Tuesday morning in Denver. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their familiar sterile glow across the polished floors where she had worked as a physical therapist for the past 3 years. At 28, Emma had dedicated her life to helping others recover from injuries, rebuild their strength, and reclaim their independence. Her patients trusted her completely, drawn to her gentle demeanor and, seemingly endless patience. What they didn't know was that Emma understood their struggles in ways that went far deeper than professional training could ever teach. The rehabilitation center was a place where hope and despair danced together daily. Patients arrived broken in body and, often in spirit, unsure if they would ever return to their former selves. Emma had witnessed countless tears of frustration, moments of breakthrough joy, and everything in between. She had become an expert at reading the subtle signs of progress, knowing exactly when to push and when to pull back, when to offer encouragement and when to simply listen. Her colleagues respected her work, but none of them truly understood the personal experiences that made her so uniquely qualified for this calling. That particular morning, Emma was running slightly behind schedule due to an unexpected traffic jam on Interstate 25. She rushed through the employee entrance, her coat still buttoned up tight against the lingering cold. The Denver winter had been particularly harsh that year, with temperatures dropping well below freezing for weeks on end. Emma had grown accustomed to wearing layers upon layers of clothing, not just for warmth, but for reasons that were far more complex and personal. As she hurried toward the employee locker room, she passed by the main therapy floor where several of her colleagues were already working with their first patients of the day. The sound of encouraging voices mixed with the mechanical hum of exercise equipment created the familiar symphony of recovery that Emma had come to love. She nodded politely to her coworkers as she passed, her mind already focused on the full day of appointments that lay ahead. Dr. Marcus Webb, the center's newest physical therapist, was standing near the reception desk reviewing patient files when Emma walked by. At 35, Marcus had recently relocated to Denver from Los Angeles, bringing with him an impressive resume and what many considered to be cutting-edge techniques in sports medicine and rehabilitation. He was tall, confident, and carried himself with the kind of swagger that suggested he believed he was the smartest person in any room he entered. Marcus had been at the center for only 6 weeks, but he had already made his presence known. He was the type of person who loved to share his opinions, whether they were solicited or not. His colleagues had quickly learned that Marcus had strong views about everything from treatment protocols to workplace policies, and he wasn't shy about expressing them. Some found his confidence refreshing, others found it abrasive. Emma had tried to give him the benefit of the doubt, chalking up his sometimes inappropriate comments to the stress of adjusting to a new job and a new city. As Emma passed by the reception desk, still bundled up in her heavy coat, Marcus looked up from his files and called out loudly enough for several people to hear. "Hey Emma, planning on taking that coat off anytime soon, or are you going to do therapy sessions looking like the Michelin Man?" His comment was delivered with a smirk that suggested he found himself quite amusing. Emma paused, feeling the familiar flush of embarrassment creeping up her neck. She had hoped to reach the locker room before anyone noticed her still wearing her outdoor clothes, but Marcus's comment had drawn attention from both staff and patients in the immediate area. She forced a polite smile and continued walking, choosing not to respond to his remark. But Marcus wasn't finished. As she walked away, he continued his commentary, his voice carrying across the open floor plan. "Seriously, what's with the coat obsession? It's got to be 75 degrees in here. Are you trying to make some kind of fashion statement, or do you have some weird medical condition we should know about?" The comment hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several staff members shifted uncomfortably, sensing that Marcus had crossed a line, even if they didn't understand exactly how or why. Emma's steps faltered for just a moment, but she kept walking, her jaw clenched tight with the effort of maintaining her composure. Patricia Chen, the center's head nurse who had worked there for over a decade, shot Marcus a disapproving look. "That's enough, Marcus," she said firmly. Patricia had always been protective of the staff, particularly Emma, whom she had watched grow from a nervous new graduate into one of their most skilled therapists. Marcus raised his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." She comes in here every day looking like she's preparing for an Arctic expedition. It's a little weird, don't you think? Emma finally reached the sanctuary of the employee locker room, her hands trembling slightly as she fumbled with her locker combination. She had dealt with ignorant comments before, but something about Marcus's public mockery felt particularly cruel. The way he had made a spectacle of her appearance, turning her into entertainment for others, brought back memories she worked hard to keep buried. The locker room was mercifully empty, giving Emma a few moments to collect herself before facing the day ahead. She stared at her reflection in the small mirror attached to the inside of her locker door, seeing the same face that had looked back at her every morning for the past 5 years. To most people, she looked perfectly normal, perhaps a bit pale, maybe a little too thin, but nothing that would suggest the reality of what lay beneath her carefully chosen clothing. Emma's relationship with clothing, particularly coats and long-sleeved shirts, was not about fashion or comfort. It was about protection, both physical and emotional. It was about maintaining a sense of control over how much of herself she revealed to the world. It was about preserving her dignity and her privacy in a society that often felt entitled to know everyone's business. As she slowly began to unbutton her coat, Emma caught herself checking the door to make sure it was securely closed. This simple act of removing outerwear, something that most people did without a second thought, required careful consideration and timing for Emma. She had developed an elaborate system of strategies to maintain her privacy while still functioning in a professional environment that required a certain level of physical activity and movement. The coat came off, revealing a long-sleeved burgundy sweater that Emma had chosen specifically because it provided coverage while still looking professional and appropriate for her work environment. Underneath the sweater was a carefully selected undershirt that provided an additional layer of protection and coverage. Every piece of clothing Emma wore was chosen with purpose, every layer served a specific function in her carefully constructed armor against the world. Marcus's comments echoed in her mind as she prepared for the day ahead. She wondered how many other people shared his curiosity about her clothing choices. She wondered how many conversations had been had behind her back, how many assumptions had been made about her character or her professionalism based on her appearance. The thought was exhausting, but not surprising. Emma had learned long ago that people would always find something to comment on, something to judge, something to use as a basis for making assumptions about who she was and what she was worth. The morning progressed with Emma throwing herself into her work with even more intensity than usual. Her first patient was Mrs. Henderson, a 72-year-old woman recovering from hip replacement surgery. Mrs. Henderson had been coming to the center for 6 weeks, and Emma had developed a special fondness for her fighting spirit and sharp wit. "You look a little tense today, dear," Mrs. Henderson observed as Emma guided her through a series of balance exercises. "Everything all right?" Emma managed a genuine smile. Mrs. Henderson had an uncanny ability to read people, a skill that Emma both admired and sometimes found uncomfortable. "Just one of those mornings, Mrs. Henderson. But I'm fine, really. How are you feeling today? Any pain in the hip?" As they worked through the exercises, Emma found herself thinking about the courage it took for patients like Mrs. Henderson to trust her with their recovery. They came to her vulnerable and scared, placing their faith in her ability to guide them back to health. They shared their fears, their frustrations, and their hopes without reservation. The relationship between a physical therapist and patient was built on trust, understanding, and mutual respect. It was everything that her interaction with Marcus that morning had not been. Throughout the day, Emma noticed that Marcus's comments had created an undercurrent of tension among the staff. Several of her colleagues approached her to offer support, clearly uncomfortable with what they had witnessed. Sarah Martinez, another physical therapist who had become a close friend, pulled Emma aside during their lunch break. "What Marcus said this morning was completely out of line," Sarah said, her voice filled with indignation. "I don't know what his problem is, but taking shots at you like that in front of everyone was unprofessional and cruel." Emma appreciated the support, but she also felt the familiar weight of having to manage other people's reactions to situations involving her. It was a burden she had carried for years, not only dealing with her own emotions and experiences, but also helping others process their discomfort when faced with ignorance or cruelty. "It's okay, Sarah. Really. Some people just don't think before they speak. But, it's not okay, Sarah insisted. You shouldn't have to put up with that kind of treatment. Maybe you should talk to Human Resources, or to Dr. Patterson about it. The suggestion made Emma's stomach tighten with anxiety. The last thing she wanted was to create more attention around herself or her appearance. She had worked hard to establish herself as a competent professional, and she feared that filing a complaint would only result in more scrutiny and more questions that she wasn't prepared to answer. As the afternoon wore on, Emma found herself hyper-aware of Marcus's presence in the clinic. She could feel his eyes on her during staff meetings, sense his judgment in his interactions with other colleagues. It was clear that his morning comments were not an isolated incident, but rather a reflection of opinions he had been forming and probably sharing since his arrival at the center. The final appointment of the day was with Jake Morrison, a 24-year-old former college football player who was recovering from a severe shoulder injury that had ended his athletic career. Jake had been one of Emma's most challenging patients, not because of his physical limitations, but because of his anger and resistance to accepting his new reality. Over the past 2 months, Emma had slowly built a relationship with Jake based on honesty, patience, and genuine care. As they worked through his exercises, Jake mentioned something that caught Emma off guard. "That new guy, Marcus, was asking me questions about you today," he said while working through a series of resistance exercises. Emma tried to keep her voice neutral. "What kind of questions?" "Weird stuff. Like whether you ever took your coat off, whether you seemed normal to me, that kind of thing." I told him it was none of his business and that you were the best therapist I'd worked with, but it was strange. Why would he be asking patients about their therapist's clothing? The revelation that Marcus was discussing her with patients crossed a professional line that Emma found deeply disturbing. It suggested that his interest in her appearance went beyond casual curiosity or thoughtless comments. It indicated a pattern of behavior that could potentially undermine her professional relationships and her reputation. That evening, as Emma prepared to leave the center, she found herself once again hyper-aware of the process of putting on her coat. The simple act had been transformed by Marcus's comments into something that felt loaded with meaning and scrutiny. She waited until the main floor was mostly empty before emerging from the locker room, hoping to avoid any additional commentary or attention. As she walked toward the exit, she noticed Marcus near the reception desk, apparently finishing up some paperwork. Their eyes met briefly, and he offered what he probably thought was a friendly smile. Emma nodded politely but didn't return the smile. She had learned over the years that maintaining professional courtesy was important, even with people who had shown themselves to be insensitive or cruel. The drive home gave Emma time to process the events of the day and to consider her options. She lived alone in a small but comfortable apartment in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, a space she had carefully curated to be her sanctuary from the outside world. The walls were painted in soft, calming colors, and every piece of furniture had been chosen for both comfort and function. It was a place where she could let her guard down, where she didn't have to worry about other people's assumptions or judgments. As she prepared dinner, Emma found herself thinking about the conversation she had avoided having with Sarah about speaking to Human Resources. Part of her knew that Marcus's behavior was inappropriate and potentially actionable. His comments had created a hostile work environment, and his decision to discuss her with patients crossed clear professional boundaries. But another part of her feared the consequences of drawing official attention to the situation. Emma had spent years building her professional reputation and establishing herself as a competent, reliable therapist. She worried that filing a complaint would inevitably lead to questions about why Marcus was so interested in her clothing choices, which would potentially lead to discussions about her personal history that she was not prepared to have with her employers or colleagues. The internal conflict was exhausting. On one hand, she knew she deserved to work in an environment free from harassment and judgment. On the other hand, she feared that standing up for herself might result in more scrutiny than staying silent. It was a catch-22 that many survivors of trauma faced, the choice between speaking up and risking exposure, or staying quiet and accepting treatment that no one should have to tolerate. As night fell over Denver, Emma found herself standing in front of her bedroom mirror, looking at her reflection in a way she hadn't done in years. For so long, she had trained herself to see only what others would see, the professional exterior, the carefully chosen clothing, the composed facial expression. But Marcus's comments had forced her to confront the reality that others were seeing something different, something that marked her as unusual or worthy of commentary. The mirror reflected back a young woman who had survived more than most people could imagine, who had rebuilt her life from the ground up, who had chosen a career dedicated to helping others heal. But it also reflected the ongoing impact of trauma, the ways in which past experiences continue to shape present choices, the delicate balance between self-protection and genuine living. Emma made a decision that night as she prepared for bed. She would not let Marcus's ignorance and cruelty dictate how she lived her life or did her job. She had faced far worse than workplace harassment and had emerged stronger. Whatever happened next, she would handle it with the same courage and dignity that had carried her through darker times. But, as she turned off the lights and settled into bed, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that her encounter with Marcus was far from over. Something in his demeanor suggested that his curiosity about her was more than casual, that his comments were building towards something more confrontational. She had learned to trust her instincts about people, and her instincts were telling her that the morning's incident was just the beginning of a much larger conflict. The last thought Emma had before falling asleep was a recognition of how far she had come and how much further she still had to go. Recovery from trauma was not a destination but a journey, and some days the journey felt longer and more difficult than others. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to choose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, and authenticity over the safety of hiding. As she drifted off to sleep, Emma held on to the knowledge that had sustained her through the darkest periods of her life. She was stronger than she looked, braver than she felt, and more resilient than anyone who judged her appearance could possibly imagine. The following morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that only comes after a night of deep, restless thinking. Emma had spent most of the night cycling between moments of determined resolution and periods of anxiety about what the day might bring. She had made the decision to maintain her professional standards regardless of Marcus's behavior, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was building beneath the surface of their workplace dynamic. Emma arrived at the rehabilitation center 15 minutes earlier than usual, hoping to settle into her routine before the full staff arrived. The early morning quiet of the facility had always been one of her favorite times, when the equipment stood ready but unused, when the potential for healing and progress hung in the air like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. She used these precious minutes to review her patient files, mentally prepare for challenging cases, and center herself for the emotional demands of her work. As she organized her treatment plans for the day, Emma noticed that her patient load was particularly heavy. Mrs. Henderson would be continuing her hip rehabilitation. Jake Morrison was scheduled for his final assessment before transitioning to independent exercises, and she had 3 new patients being admitted for initial evaluations. One of them was a young woman named Lisa Chen who was recovering from injuries sustained in a car accident 6 months earlier. According to her file, Lisa had been making slow progress with her previous therapist and was being transferred to Emma's care in hopes of achieving better results. The morning staff meeting was scheduled for 8 o'clock, and Emma found herself dreading it more than usual. These meetings typically covered policy updates, patient progress reports, and scheduling issues, but she worried that Marcus might use the group setting as another opportunity to make inappropriate comments about her or other staff members. She had observed over the past weeks that Marcus seemed to enjoy having an audience for his observations and opinions. Dr. Patricia Patterson, the center's director, called the meeting to order precisely at 8. Dr. Patterson was a woman in her early 50s who had built the rehabilitation center from a small clinic into one of Denver's most respected facilities. She was known for her direct communication style, her commitment to patient care, and her zero tolerance for unprofessional behavior among staff members. As the meeting progressed through routine business items, Emma began to relax slightly. Marcus was present but seemed focused on the agenda items rather than looking for opportunities to make personal comments. She started to think that perhaps the previous day's incident had been an isolated occurrence, that maybe Marcus had recognized the inappropriateness of his behavior and would modify it going forward. Her hope was short-lived. During the discussion about new patient intake procedures, Marcus raised his hand and addressed the group. "I've been thinking about our professional presentation standards," he began, his tone suggesting that he was about to make what he considered an important contribution to the conversation. I think we need to consider how our appearance affects patient confidence in our abilities. Dr. Patterson looked puzzled. Can you be more specific about your concerns, Marcus? Well, Marcus continued, glancing briefly at Emma before addressing the group at large, I think patients notice when therapists don't look professional or seem to have their own issues they're dealing with. For instance, if a therapist is constantly bundled up in heavy clothing or seems uncomfortable with basic professional interactions, it might make patients question their competence. The room fell uncomfortably silent. Several staff members shifted in their chairs, and Emma felt her face flush with embarrassment and anger. Marcus had managed to target her specifically while maintaining the pretense of making a general policy suggestion. It was a calculated move that demonstrated both cunning and cruelty. Sarah Martinez spoke up immediately. I think our professional standards are already quite clear, and they focus on clinical competence and patient outcomes, not personal appearance preferences. Of course, clinical competence is important, Marcus replied smoothly, but patient confidence is also crucial for successful outcomes. If patients are distracted by a therapist's unusual behavior or appearance, it can interfere with the therapeutic relationship. Emma felt something shift inside her as she listened to Marcus essentially argue that her clothing choices made her unfit for her profession. For years, she had worked to prove herself through her results, her patient relationships, and her dedication to excellence. Her patient satisfaction scores were among the highest in the facility, her success rates exceeded department averages, and she had received multiple commendations for her work. Yet Marcus was suggesting that none of that mattered because he had personal opinions about her appearance. Marcus, Emma said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system, are you suggesting that there are specific staff members whose appearance is negatively affecting patient care? The directness of her question seemed to catch Marcus off guard. He had clearly expected to be able to make his point without being challenged directly. I'm just saying that we should all be mindful of how we present ourselves professionally. But, you mentioned specific behaviors and appearance issues, Emma continued, her professional training in conflict resolution kicking in. If you have concerns about a particular staff member's performance or professional presentation, shouldn't those be addressed through proper channels rather than discussed in a general staff meeting? Dr. Patterson intervened before Marcus could respond. Emma makes an excellent point. If anyone has specific concerns about individual staff members, those should be brought to my attention privately, not discussed in group settings. Our professional standards are clearly outlined in our employee handbook, and I expect all staff members to adhere to them. However, I also expect all staff members to treat each other with respect and professionalism. The meeting continued, but the tension in the room was palpable. Emma had essentially called Marcus out for his inappropriate behavior, and he had been gently but firmly redirected by their supervisor. However, Emma could see from Marcus's expression that he was not pleased with being challenged, and she suspected that their conflict was far from resolved. After the meeting ended, Emma was approached by several colleagues who expressed support for how she had handled Marcus's comments. Tom Rodriguez, one of the senior physical therapists, pulled her aside as they walked back to the main therapy floor. That was well done in there, Tom said quietly. Marcus has been making inappropriate comments since he started, but what he did today crossed a line. You handled it professionally, but you shouldn't have had to handle it at all. Emma appreciated the support, but she was also aware that her decision to confront Marcus directly had likely escalated their conflict. She knew from experience that people like Marcus didn't respond well to being challenged publicly, especially by someone they had already targeted for negative attention. Her first patient of the day was Lisa Chen, the young woman who was transferring to Emma's care after making limited progress with her previous therapist. Lisa arrived for her appointment 15 minutes early, walking carefully with the aid of a cane and moving with the cautious precision of someone who had learned not to trust her body completely. During their initial consultation, Emma learned more about Lisa's situation. The car accident had resulted in multiple injuries including a severe concussion, fractured ribs, and significant soft tissue damage to her back and shoulders. The physical injuries had healed reasonably well, but Lisa was struggling with chronic pain, limited range of motion, and what she described as a complete loss of confidence in her physical abilities. My last therapist kept telling me that my limitations were mostly psychological at this point, Lisa explained as Emma conducted a thorough physical assessment. He said I was letting fear hold me back and that I needed to push through the discomfort to make real progress. Emma nodded thoughtfully as she documented Lisa's current range of motion and pain levels. She had encountered this attitude before among some practitioners, the belief that patients who weren't progressing quickly enough were somehow failing to try hard enough or were allowing psychological factors to interfere with their recovery. Pain is real, whether it's physical or psychological, Emma told Lisa as they began a series of gentle mobility exercises. Our job is to work with your body as it is right now, not as someone thinks it should be. Recovery happens at different rates for different people, and there's no schedule that everyone has to follow. As they worked together, Emma found herself thinking about the parallels between Lisa's situation and her own. Both of them had experienced trauma that continued to affect their daily lives in ways that weren't always visible to others. Both of them had been judged by people who couldn't see or understand the full scope of their experiences. Both of them were working to reclaim their lives and their sense of agency in a world that often had little patience for the complexities of recovery. The session with Lisa went exceptionally well. By the end of their hour together, Lisa had achieved better range of motion than she had experienced in months, and, more importantly, she was smiling and expressing optimism about her recovery for the first time in a long time. You really get it, Lisa said as they finished up the session. I can tell that you understand what it's like to feel like your body isn't really yours anymore. Emma was struck by the accuracy of Lisa's observation. She did understand that feeling, probably more deeply than most of her colleagues could. But she also realized that her understanding came from personal experience rather than just professional training, and that recognition brought both comfort and vulnerability. As the day progressed, Emma noticed that Marcus seemed to be paying unusually close attention to her interactions with patients and colleagues. She caught him watching her during therapy sessions, observed him lingering near her workspace during breaks, and heard from other staff members that he had been asking additional questions about her work methods and patient relationships. The behavior was becoming concerning from both a professional and personal safety standpoint. Emma had learned over the years to pay attention to people who showed excessive interest in her personal life or professional activities, as such interest often preceded more problematic behavior. During her lunch break, Emma decided to document the incidents that had occurred over the past 2 days. She wrote down Marcus's original comments about her coat, his questions to patients about her behavior, his comments during the morning staff meeting, and his current pattern of observation and inquiry. She wasn't sure what she would do with this documentation, but she knew from experience that keeping detailed records was important when dealing with potentially escalating harassment. As she finished her notes, Sarah Martinez joined her in the break room. Sarah looked concerned and slightly agitated, which was unusual for her normally calm demeanor. Emma, I need to tell you something, Sarah said, checking to make sure they were alone in the break room. Marcus approached me during lunch and started asking questions about you. He wanted to know if you had ever mentioned any medical conditions, if you had ever seemed unstable or unprofessional, if patients had ever complained about you. It was really inappropriate, and it made me uncomfortable. Emma felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. Marcus's behavior was escalating from inappropriate comments to what amounted to an investigation into her personal and professional life. The pattern was becoming reminiscent of workplace harassment situations she had read about, where one individual systematically attempted to undermine another's professional standing. What did you tell him? Emma asked. I told him that you were one of the most professional and competent therapists I had ever worked with, and that his questions were inappropriate. I also told him that if he had concerns about any staff member, he should address them with Dr. Patterson rather than gossiping with other colleagues. Emma was grateful for Sarah's support, but she was also increasingly concerned about the direction Marcus's behavior was taking. What had started as thoughtless comments about her appearance was evolving into a systematic effort to gather information that could potentially be used to damage her professional reputation. The afternoon brought another incident that confirmed Emma's growing concerns. While she was working with Jake Morrison on his final assessment, Marcus appeared at their therapy station and interrupted their session. Jake, how's the session going? Marcus asked, his tone overly friendly and professional. Jake looked confused by the interruption. Fine. Emma's been great to work with throughout my recovery." "That's wonderful to hear," Marcus continued. "I'm always interested in learning about different therapy approaches. Emma, would you mind explaining your treatment philosophy for Jake's injury?" The question was phrased as a professional inquiry, but Emma recognized it as another attempt to observe and, potentially, criticize her work. She also noticed that Marcus was positioning himself in a way that would allow him to see any physical contact between her and her patient during the therapy exercises. Emma maintained her professional composure and briefly explained her approach to treating Jake's shoulder injury, focusing on gradual strength building and functional movement patterns. Marcus nodded and asked several follow-up questions that seemed designed more to prolong his observation than to gain genuine clinical insights. After Marcus left, Jake looked at Emma with a puzzled expression. "That guy gives me the creeps," he said. "He's been asking other patients about their therapists too. Some of the guys think he's trying to gather dirt on people or something." The revelation that Marcus was systematically questioning multiple patients about their therapists was deeply troubling. It suggested a pattern of behavior that went beyond personal animosity toward Emma and indicated potential professional misconduct that could affect multiple staff members and patients. As the workday neared its end, Emma found herself facing a decision that she had been avoiding for 2 days. She could continue to try to handle Marcus's behavior through professional courtesy and documentation, hoping that it would eventually resolve itself, or she could take the more difficult but potentially necessary step of formally reporting his conduct to Dr. Patterson. The decision was complicated by her awareness that filing a formal complaint would likely result in investigations, interviews, and scrutiny that might eventually lead to questions about her personal history and her reasons for wearing concealing clothing. However, she was also recognizing that Marcus's behavior was not likely to stop on its own and might actually escalate if left unchecked. As she prepared to leave for the day, Emma made a decision that surprised her with its clarity and determination. She walked to Dr. Patterson's office and knocked on the door, asking if she could schedule a private meeting to discuss a professional concern. Dr. Patterson agreed to meet with her first thing the following morning, and Emma felt both relief and anxiety about the step she was taking. That evening, Emma spent considerable time preparing for her meeting with Dr. Patterson. She organized her documentation of Marcus's behavior, thought carefully about how to present her concerns in a professional and objective manner, and considered what information she was and was not prepared to share about her personal circumstances. As she got ready for bed, Emma found herself thinking about courage and what it meant in different contexts. She had survived experiences that required tremendous courage, and she had rebuilt her life through daily acts of bravery that most people would never recognize or understand. Now she was facing a different kind of courage test, the courage to stand up for herself in a professional environment, to demand the respect and dignity that every person deserved in their workplace. The night passed slowly, with Emma alternating between confidence in her decision and anxiety about the potential consequences. She knew that speaking up was the right thing to do, both for herself and, potentially, for other colleagues and patients who might be affected by Marcus's behavior. She also knew that taking this step would likely change the dynamics of her workplace permanently. As dawn broke over Denver, Emma prepared for what she suspected would be a pivotal day in her professional life. She dressed carefully, choosing clothing that made her feel confident and professional while still providing the coverage and protection that she needed for her emotional well-being. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw not just a trauma survivor, but a strong professional woman who had every right to work in an environment free from harassment and judgment. The drive to work was filled with nervous energy, but also with a sense of purpose that Emma had not felt in years. She was about to take control of a situation that had been controlling her, and, regardless of the outcome, she knew that she would be proud of herself for having the courage to speak up. Emma arrived at the rehabilitation center 30 minutes before her scheduled meeting with Dr. Patterson, using the extra time to review her notes one final time and to mentally prepare for what she knew would be a difficult conversation. The early morning quiet of the facility felt different today, charged with the anticipation of change that comes when someone decides to stop accepting unacceptable treatment. Dr. Patterson's office was located on the second floor of the building, with large windows that looked out over the Denver skyline. The office reflected its occupant's personality, professional but warm, organized but not sterile, with several framed photographs of successful patients mixed among diplomas and professional certifications. Emma had only been in this office a handful of times since she started working at the center, usually for positive occasions like performance reviews or discussions about professional development opportunities. When Emma knocked on the door at exactly 8 o'clock, Dr. Patterson welcomed her with the kind of focused attention that had made her such an effective leader. She gestured for Emma to take a seat in one of the comfortable chairs arranged near her desk, and Emma noticed that Dr. Patterson had already set aside other work to give this conversation her full attention. "Emma, you mentioned that you had a professional concern you wanted to discuss," Dr. Patterson began, her tone indicating that she was prepared to listen carefully and take any concerns seriously. "Please, tell me what's going on." Emma had rehearsed this conversation multiple times in her mind, but actually sitting in Dr. Patterson's office and beginning to speak about Marcus's behavior felt more difficult than she had anticipated. She started by outlining the specific incidents she had documented, beginning with Marcus's initial comments about her coat and progressing through his behavior at the staff meeting and his pattern of questioning patients and colleagues about her work. As Emma spoke, she watched Dr. Patterson's expression grow increasingly serious. It was clear that the center's director was hearing about some of these incidents for the first time, and that she was not pleased with what she was learning about her newest staff member's behavior. "I want to make sure I understand the full scope of what you're describing," Dr. Patterson said when Emma finished her initial account. "You're telling me that Marcus has made repeated personal comments about your appearance, has discussed you with patients during their treatment sessions, has attempted to gather information about you from other staff members, and has used staff meetings as a forum to make sometimes the strongest people are those who fight battles others can't see. They walk among us every day, carrying invisible wounds and silent struggles that shape them into warriors. Their scars tell stories of survival, resilience, and courage that most of us will never fully understand. But what happens when someone judges these hidden heroes before knowing their truth? What happens when mockery meets reality, and prejudice faces the raw power of human strength?" This is the story of Emma Rodriguez, a 28-year-old physical therapist who learned that appearances can be devastatingly deceiving, and how one moment of cruelty became a life-changing lesson for everyone involved. It's about the assumptions we make, the judgments we pass, and the incredible strength that lies beneath the surface of ordinary people living extraordinary lives. In a world where everyone seems to have an opinion about everyone else, Emma's story reminds us that we never truly know what someone has endured to become who they are today. Her journey from victim to victor, from broken to beautiful, from whispered about to respected, will challenge everything you think you know about strength, courage, and the power of the human spirit. Get ready to witness a story that will make you question your own assumptions and remind you that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes, they wear coats that hide the evidence of battles they've already won.